Okay, welcome back. This is week 7 of IGB100. We are basically continuing on from week 6 where we left off. We've got a lot of stuff to get through, so let's just jump straight into it. So this week we are going to be dealing with setting up a basic weapon for the player so that they can actually interact with the enemies from last week. This is also going to deal with setting up a basic animation using the legacy animation system in Unity, as well as setting up some weapon effects such as a muzzle flash. Most importantly though, we'll be dealing with actually making this weapon do some kind of damage, and that's going to be a pretty heavy scripting section using a raycast process, as well as adjusting the enemies so that they can actually deal damage to the players, because currently right now they pretty much just bump into you and they don't really do anything too interesting at this point. So to get started with the weapon setup, we've actually, as you would expect, given you some models appropriate for the weapons. We have a few that you may want to select from here. If you navigate to the Sci-Fi Gun Collection in the Models folder, you'll be able to have a look at what we have. Now, if you're unhappy with any of them, feel free to grab alternatives from the Asset Store. I am going to use the Grim brand weapon just because it's nice and small. But first of all, just expand your FPS controller, which is your player, so that your first-person character is visible. I want you to drop whatever model you prefer onto that character. So you'll see that it's suspended in space here. It's a little bit tiny, so I might just make it maybe 5 times larger. And we'll need to position this a little bit more precisely with relation to where our camera actually is. So if I make that maybe 0.2 on the X, on the Y I might reduce it by about 0.35, and finally on the Z make that 0.5. There we go. You can actually see the weapon appearing below there. And that's it. That's the positioning for the weapon done. We may want to tweak that slightly depending on which weapon you actually attach, but it looks like it'll be fine. In fact, if I just press play now, that actually looks like it's positioned well enough for me to be happy with that. Cool. So we actually need to attach a couple more empties to this weapon. In fact, I'm going to call it weapon just because we might do something with the system later on where we have a weapon switching mechanic. First of all though, the first empty we need to attach will be a muzzle. Now this muzzle should be attached to the weapon itself, and basically it needs to be where the muzzle of the weapon should be. So basically that's where the bullet is going to come out. So this is going to allow us to make muzzle effects occur from the correct place on the weapon. And you can imagine, things like ejecting brass would have the same effect, possibly somewhere on the side of the weapon. But for the moment, we're just going to deal with a muzzle effect as well. The other empty we need to add is a target empty, so where we're actually going to be shooting projectiles from our raycast system. So attach another empty to the weapon, and we'll call this raycast target. This is where we're going to be, the direction we're shooting in basically. And I just want you to, I guess we could leave most of those settings, but make that about -10 on the Y. So that is roughly where we're aiming our gun. So that might be not so much the max range, but the max range at which this gun is accurate to, which is pretty far, but it's fine for the moment. So the next thing we're going to do is add a basic animation, a basic firing animation to our weapon. So make sure you have the weapon selected. I want you, if there is an animator component attached to this weapon, just get rid of it and attach a component miscellaneous animation component instead. So we don't want an animator, we want an animation. So to create an animation, have your weapon selected with an animation component and open up Window Animation. We're going to create an animation. Let's call it Fire, and we're going to save it to the animations directory in our assets folder. Initially it won't look like much. We need to add a property, and the property that we want to change here is just the positioning of our weapon. Now, we don't need this animation to last anything longer than a fraction of a second. It's currently set to be of length 1 second. I'm going to bring that all the way down to 1/10 of a second, or 10 milliseconds. Just zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to extend this list, and specifically I want to move the Z axis here, or the object's forward axis. So initially we're going to have it set to be at 0.5 on the Z, and 2 frames after it I want you to add a new keyframe, and this keyframe is basically just going to move the gun back slightly, so that when you have your animation play, you have this rapid fire staccato effect. And you may even want to tighten that animation up slightly so it's even a little bit faster. I might just make it really quick. So yeah, that's looking about right. That's looking a bit more like a machine gun should. Cool. So we'll stick with that. If you want, you can put this animation window somewhere in your active UI. Before we can use it though, we need to make sure that it is set as a legacy animation. And the easiest way to do that is just to click on this animation. We'll make it wrap, because we do want it to repeat over and over again. But I want you to click this list that's next to this lock icon here on the far right. Go to debug, and if this is not ticked as a legacy animation, you need to make it one. Otherwise the animation component won't be able to detect it. So one other art asset, or asset in general, that we should set up before we start coding this weapon is the sound that the gun makes when you shoot it. There are a few ways you can actually approach this, but the most straightforward way for making proximity-based audio occur, especially if you want the audio to overlap itself, is to just make it empty. Call it the sound that you want, such as fire sound, and attach a component audio source to it. Whoop, that was the wrong one, sorry. Audio source. And in this section you should have the capacity to put an audio clip. Now the one that I want in particular is machine gun fire, which you should also have available. But I also want to recycle this. I want to make it delete itself so that the sound isn't there forever. It's not a whole heap of empties in the scene every time you fire this weapon. So I'm going to attach a script that we actually have for you. It's a very straightforward, simple script. It's kill object, and all it does is make the object persist for a length of time. In this case, I think 1 second is probably appropriate, so we can leave it. And to test that, you can just press the game. If you hear a fire sound and see this object disappear, you know you would have done it right. Whoa, that sounds about right. Alright, so let's put all of this together. What we're going to need to do for that is make a new script, and we'll call it weapon. Now it's possible we may make other weapons in the future, have some kind of system where we can swap weapons out or between each other. For the moment though, we'll just call it weapon and attach the weapon script to our weapon in question. Open that up in Visual Studio. Now the first thing we're going to do is make a reference to our animation component, which requires in start to make an animation equals a get component call to our animation component. So that allows us to talk to the animation that we actually set up on our object in question, which is great. Following this, we want some damage variables. Now these are going to be straightforward variables. that are familiar to you at this point, such as damage. We might have something as low as 10. It's not going to be that powerful a weapon because it is going to be a rapid fire weapon, or at least my version is, and we might set that to something like 0.15. Finally, we want a timer, so we can have a variable such as fire time just to keep track of when it is the next time to shoot. We also want to spawn effects and target objects. The first effect that we're going to be using will be a public game object muzzle flash, as well as a public game object bullet hit. Now these are set up for you already within the package that we've given you. They're basically just detonator explosion effects. You can tweak them if you want, you can make new ones. We're just spawning game objects basically, so there's nothing really new here. However, the muzzle flash will be coming from a public game object muzzle. And finally, the target object is something that we're going to be raycasting towards, so we need to say we want a public game object target, the thing we're roughly shooting at, or the thing that's going to be accurate towards in the distance. Finally, one more effect that we're going to add will just be an audio effect, and that'll be a public game object fire sound. Cool. Now we might as well connect all of this up in Unity right now, just so we don't have to do it later. So if you've done it right, your weapon script should be updated. Our muzzle flash is going to be a detonator effect. The bullet hit is going to be the sparks effect. The muzzle is going to be the muzzle on the weapon. The target is going to be our raycast target. And finally, the fire sound is going to be that fire sound that we just made. Okay, so let's set up the actual weapon firing system. Now, we'll make a method call to a weapon firing method. And we'll make this below update a private void weapon firing. So the first part of this is going to be a conditional check to see if we are putting some kind of input in, and that's going to be a get mouse button call. We're going to talk about the left hand or left button. So if we're pressing that or holding that down and its time is greater than the fire time, then let's do something about that. It's basically that is the condition for where all of the weapon firing code is going to exist, including the spawning of effects, the raycast system, everything, for spawning sounds as well. Before I jump into this though, I should mention that most ballistic weapons in video games use some kind of raycast system. So you think of a game like Counter-Strike or even the Call of Duties, when you shoot a bullet and the bullet instantly hits a target, that's typically using some kind of raycast method. And that's what we're going to be programming here. Before that though, let's spawn some of those effects that we were talking about just before. Let's first of all instantiate our fire sound. And we're going to do that at our transform.position and our transform.rotation. Cool. We should also spawn the muzzle effect. So let's put that in there. But it'll be the muzzle flash that we spawn, and instead of just transform.position, it's going to be the muzzle's transform.position. And rotation. So we're spawning a muzzle flash at the end of our weapon where we put that muzzle. Finally, let's play that animation that we set up just before. So we want to call our animation component, specifically call the play method, and feed it a string parameter, which I believe we called it fire with a small f. So that'll do it for effects. That should spawn everything in question. It's just currently we don't have the capacity to do damage, but we can check this system. And what we might do just before we start doing damage is just increase the next fire time. So we'll call this something like setup next time to fire. And we can say our fire time is equal to whatever the current time is, time, plus the fire rate. So we can't do damage, but we can check to see if this system is going to work. Let's do that. So assuming everything is set up correctly, you're not getting any red errors. If we go into the game now, that's kind of working-ish. So it's possible I may have set this to loop. Yes. Let's take that off. That's not actually what we wanted there. So if I go back into the game now and just shoot a couple of times, we can see that that's roughly doing the trick. Cool. It looks like we may need to make the muzzle flash effect just a little bit bigger. I might set that to, I don't know, 3. I'm just going to disable the audio on this because it's probably a little bit loud. We check it again now. Yeah, it's looking a little bit more like a really crappy muzzle effect, but that'll do. So let's actually address dealing damage with this weapon. So going back into your script, let's make a new bit of code. We'll call it raycast projectile. Now to do this, we need to set up a new object type called a raycast hit, and we'll call it hit. Now hit is going to be what's called an out variable within an if statement conditional call. Now this is very powerful because it allows us to store information inside of a variable, outputting it to it within a conditional check. And you'll see why this is strong in a moment. So what we can do is call specifically a physics.raycast method that is going to raycast from the muzzle.transform.position, and it's going to raycast along a vector. This vector is going to be negative muzzle.transform.position minus the target.transform.position. Now we don't care how large this vector is, we don't really care about its magnitude, we only care about the direction that it's pointing in. So we can normalize this vector by attaching the normalized parameter to its end. So that's the direction that we're shooting in. We then want to output the information to our hit variable, and finally let's raycast at a length of say 50 unity units. Cool. That is our if statement. So within this check we will be outputting to hit, which means we can check to see within the conditional what is this hit information talking about. So we can say if the hit.transform.tag is equal to enemy, then we can do something about that. In this case, all we want to do is tell the hit.transform to make a direct get component call to the enemy script that will obviously be attached to it because it's an enemy. And we want to tell that enemy to take damage. So if you got that popping up, you know it's on the right track. And we want to tell it to take damage. I think we set that damage to 10. Cool. Finally, just to finish this off, we'll attach the hit effect within this. So if we actually are hitting an enemy, then we can instantiate the bullet hit, and that will just be at the hit.transform.position and the hit.transform.rotation. So basically spawn the bullet hit effect, which in this case is just sparks. I mean, if you were shooting a fleshy thing, it might be blood, whatever. If you're shooting a tree, it might be wood. Cool, so we can actually test this now. Go back into Unity. I'm going to keep sound off just for the sake of playtesting, so you can actually hear me. If I play the game now, there's an enemy. I don't have a crosshair yet, but if I just shoot this thing enough, it disappeared. And that will continue happening. So they're dying, which is fantastic. Isn't it awesome when things die? So there is an error popping up here. I know exactly what that is. It's trying to spawn a death effect here. And we haven't assigned one, basically. So if we go to our enemy prefab, which I believe I put here, you'll notice that we don't have a death effect signed. So if you just drag in the explosion effect into here, you'll get rid of the death effect from causing errors. Cool. So one thing you may have noticed with the weapon is that it actually is casting a shadow. So when you actually play the game, you'll notice that there's this weird shadow being cast floating around. We can actually turn that off if we just go to cast shadows off in the mesh renderer component of the weapon. Currently our enemy is not able to do damage to us either. Now that's not so much an issue with the enemy. The enemy is set up to effectively deal damage to any object that it runs into that's tagged as player, but the player isn't set up. So first of all, make sure your FPS controller is tagged as player. You will then need to give it a box collider. So just showing you that again, if we go to physics, box collider, mark that as a trigger, maybe make it a bit bigger, and finally attach the player script. So currently that's all that exists. Here's a bit of health. If you press play now, if you walk into an enemy player, your health should start dropping and eventually you'll die. So what you may have noticed just then is that when we as a player die, the game kind of freaks out a bit. It's because the only active camera that's actually attached to our player, which is on the first person character, it gets removed because our player takes damage and eventually gets destroyed. So if we don't want that to happen, we will need, and if you remember correctly, I told you not to delete the main camera here, we need to set this one as active. So what we need to do is in player, make a public game object reference to the main camera, and then set the main camera to be active when the player gets destroyed. So what this will do is in the game, if you just tell your actual player object, here's the main camera, when you go ahead and die, finally, just to complete this process off, I'm just going to add a crosshair to our game. So if you go to game object UI, we'll first of all add a canvas into our UI system, because this is actually going to carry on into next week. We'll call this UI, and we'll scale our UI with screen size so that everything that we set up in this resolution will scale regardless of the resolution that we actually play the game in. I then want you, with the UI selected, to make another game object, UI text. We'll call this text crosshair, and you would obviously put a better graphic system in place than this, but I'm just going to put a plus sign here. And I probably should center this on our screen. I'm just going to adjust its width and height to be about 25, maybe make it red. And that's looking about right. That's looking roughly center of the screen there. Could possibly make it a little bit bigger, maybe 20. But that should give us a pretty okay crosshair for the time being. It's functional, at least. So, at this point, we have the core of a simple first-person shooter. Next week, we're going to walk into making this game a little bit more interesting in terms of giving you some objectives to complete, perhaps within a time limit. So currently, we're just going to shoot these until they all die, until the spawners in question stop spawning. Let's maybe give you a reward for doing that. So currently, there isn't really anything to do except that, unless you just want to restart the game and continue doing that. So, next week's work.